so far introduced the methodology as a philosophy at the core of what we see and how we approach issues. And then we apply the methodology or that way of thinking that is based on the revelation to two important aspects of our study. Basically, the aspect of understanding the reality, perceiving the reality, and the other aspect was the aspect of perceiving history. And we try to explore how can we perceive the reality through the maqasid approach, through that composite approach of the objectives, the concepts, the values, universal laws, the groups, the proofs, and the commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the revelation. Now, this lecture is about the fundamental theories of the methodology, which is basically how did we come up with that? Why are we focusing on the objectives, the concepts, the values, the universal laws, and so on? I will start with some of this, and a couple of you ask me questions. You can, inshallah, ask your questions as you wish, as we move and discuss. I will start, though, by basically highlighting the importance of this lecture in the course, because this is about the fundamental theories of the maqasid methodology, or basically the basic definitions of the elements of study that we follow as we try to come up with a maqasidi approach or an Islamic approach for our time in terms of research and in terms of activism. Usul al-fiqh, if you read the Arabic, it says Usul al-fiqh al-maqasidi. Usul al-fiqh is the same. Usul al-fiqh is basically المنهجية التي تحكم استنباط الأحكام الشرعية من أدلتها التفصيلية. A number of definitions, which is basically Usul al-fiqh is the methodology that governs the extraction of the rules from the evidences. This is the basic definition. And this is the same definition that we have here. What is the methodology that governs the extraction of the rules from the evidence? The rules, though, are not the partial and particular rules as in the commands. The rules here are basically the fundamental rules that are going to guide our exploration of the topics. So basically, how can we build a composite perception of the reality and of history, and then how can we realize this perception in the reality? So now therefore, Usul al-fiqh here would be the method of extracting, as I said, judgment from evidences, but which judgment and which evidences? This is the question here. Therefore, the definition here of the fundamental theories is the induction of the methodological maqasid from the book and the sunnah. They form a composite perception of the elements of any topic and govern judgments related to the individual and the public. Now, let us look at a couple of points here, side points, but important in the reading of the fundamentals in the evidences or in the scripts or in the revelation. One is the relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran and the Sunnah are different in the sense of what they call al-thubut, or the historical basically authenticity. Not because the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ itself is not a revelation, it's because the narration of it is a human process that is subject to error. You see, there is a difference between the narration of the Quran and the narration of the Sunnah. The narration of the Quran is basically a script that was gathered over 23 years and that was narrated by dozens of people after dozens of people in a way that is beyond doubt. Like there is no doubt in the narrations of the Quran, because we have many people who narrated the same ayat after the Prophet ﷺ. And the Quran by nature is narrated verbatim. It's not narrated by meaning. The Sunnah is different because it is narrated by meaning. Anybody who has any experience with the books of hadith, you will know that every hadith is narrated according to a number of narrations. Bukhari number 1, إنما الأعمال بالنيات إنما العمل بالنية فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ومن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة يتزوجها أو امرأة ينكحها فمن هاجر إلى and so forth, which means that all of them are narrated by the meaning. It's the same meaning, and it is one of the main hadith that is confirmed to have been said like that. But it is narrated by the meaning, because all the authentic lines of the same hadith, and so is the situation of the majority of the hadith, are authentic lines that differ in some of the words. That's number one. Number two, the narration itself by the narrators is subject to the narrator's version of the story, which might be different from another narrator. It is subject to where the hadith appeared in the books of hadith, and therefore what we mentioned last time is that the hadith could be cut in a number of portions in order to fit the chapters that the hadith was put under, and so forth. And therefore here, when we read the maqasid in the Quran or the Sunnah, we have to know that the Quran here is the main document. Not because the Sunnah has less legitimacy. The Sunnah is as legitimate, but because the narration of the Sunnah is subject to these compound factors of narrating by essence, and also the narrators and the way they chapterized their narrations and how they put the hadith under that. And of course, the difference is over the narrators, who's authentic and who's not, which is also a significant factor, and so forth. So therefore, when we look for the maqasid in the Quran and Sunnah, the Quran has to be at the core of that process. And the Sunnah is an illustration of it. The Sunnah revolves around the Quran. Yes, it could add some details that are not in the Quran. Scholars debated that, but let's agree with that it adds details, sure. But it also revolves around the Quran and its topics. So when we talk today about the methodological maqasid, what we are trying to read in the Quran is basically what are the objectives that are related to the methodology. So we are not going to read the maqasid as in the maqasid of the creation, that we worship Allah and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything in truth, and so on. We're not looking at the maqasid of the Sharia, which is establishing justice and mercy and common good. We are not looking at the the maqasid of the sending of messengers and revelation of books and so on, which is the establishing of equity and calling people to Islam and so forth. We're not looking at those. We're looking at the maqasid of the methodology of the Quran. So when the Quran is telling us about something, what is the method that the Quran uses in order to tell us about these things and in order to establish the truth about these things? And in order for us to look into this question in a more tangible way, because if you open the Quran and look for the methodology, you will probably get basically lost in the details. The Quran is not like any human book or little books that are divided into chapters and topics. The Quran takes you on a journey for particular purposes. So the surah, from the beginning to the end, it has different topics. It has, different endings of the ayat, different expressions and so on. But the surah is a journey towards some objectives. And if you meet a story in the middle of the surah, the story is different between the surahs because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the story in this context to serve a particular end and different context to serve another end. And when you meet a simile in one of the surahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the simile in that particular context to explain a certain concept or to explain a particular situation by way of simile that could be more familiar than the meaning that it is explaining. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the creation, there are certain objectives from that. So the first methodological maqsad or al-maqsad al-manhaji, if you look at